Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 25. Enter Prince Charming. "I'm contrasting the claims of indoors and out," said Anne, looking from the window of Patty's Place to the distant pines of the park. "I've an afternoon to spend in sweet doing nothing, Aunt Jimsy. Shall I spend it here, where there is a cozy fire, a plateful of delicious russets, 3 purring and harmonious cats, and 2 impeccable china dogs with green noses? Or shall I go to the park, where there is the lure of grey woods and of grey water lapping on the harbour rocks?"
"If I was as young as you, I'd decide in favor of the park,"
said Aunt Jamesina, tickling Joseph's yellow ear with a knitting needle. "I thought that you claimed to be as young as any of us, Auntie," teased Anne.
"Yes, in my soul. But I'll admit my legs aren't as young as yours. You go and get some fresh air, Anne. You look pale lately."
"I think I'll go to the park," said Anne restlessly. "I don't feel like tame domestic joys today. I want to feel alone and free and wild. The park will be empty, for everyone will be at the football match."
"Why didn't you go to it?"
"Nobody axed me, sir," she said. "At least, nobody but that horrid little Dan Ranger. I wouldn't go anywhere with him. But rather than hurt his poor little tender feelings, I said I wasn't going to the game at all. I don't mind. I'm not in the mood for football today, somehow."
"You go and get some fresh air,"
repeated Aunt Jamesina.
"but take your umbrella, for I believe it's going to rain. I've rheumatism in my leg."
"Only old people should have rheumatism, Auntie."
"Anybody is liable to rheumatism in her legs, Anne. It's only old people who should have rheumatism in their souls, though. Thank goodness I never have. When you get rheumatism in your soul, you might as well go and pick out your coffin."
It was November, the month of crimson sunsets, parting birds, deep sad hymns of the sea, passionate wind-songs in the pines. Anne roamed through the pineland alleys in the park and, as she said, let that great sweeping wind blow the fogs out of her soul. Anne was not wont to be troubled with soul fog, but somehow, since her return to Redmond for this 3rd year, life had not mirrored her spirit back to her with its old, perfect, sparkling clearness. Outwardly, existence at Patty's Place was the same pleasant round of work and study and recreation that it had always been. On Friday evenings, the big fire-lighted living-room was crowded by callers and echoed to endless jest and laughter, while Aunt Jamesina smiled beamingly on them all. The Jonas of Phil's letter came often, running up from St. Columbia on the early train and departing on the late. He was a general favourite at Patty's Place, though Aunt Jamesina shook her head and opined that divinity students were not what they used to be.
"He's very nice, my dear,"
she told Phil.
"but ministers ought to be graver and more dignified."
"Can't a man laugh and be a Christian still?"
demanded Phil.
"Oh, men, yes. But I was speaking of ministers, my dear,"
said Aunt Jamesina rebukingly.
"and you shouldn't flirt so with Mr. Blake. You really shouldn't."
"I'm not flirting with him,"
protested Phil. Nobody believed her, except Anne. The others thought she was amusing herself as usual, and told her roundly that she was behaving very badly.
"Mr. Blake isn't the Alec and Alonzo type, Phil,"
said Stella severely.
"He takes things seriously. You may break his heart."
"Do you really think I could?"
asked Phil.
"I'd love to think so."
"Philippa Gordon, I never thought you were utterly unfeeling. The idea of you saying you'd love to break a man's heart."
"I didn't say so, honey. Quote me correctly. I said I'd like to think I could break it. I would like to know I had the power to do it."
"I don't understand you, Phil. You are leading that man on deliberately, and you know you don't mean anything by it."
"I mean to make him ask me to marry him if I can,"
said Phil calmly.
"I give you up,"
said Stella hopelessly. Gilbert came occasionally on Friday evenings. He seemed always in good spirits, and held his own in the jests and repartee that flew about. He neither sought nor avoided Anne. When circumstances brought them in contact, he talked to her pleasantly and courteously, as to any newly made acquaintance. The old camaraderie was gone entirely. Anne felt it keenly, but she told herself she was very glad and thankful that Gilbert had got so completely over his disappointment in regard to her. She had really been afraid, that April evening in the orchard, that she had hurt him terribly, and that the wound would be long in healing. Now she saw that she need not have worried. Men have died and the worms have eaten them, but not for love. Gilbert evidently was in no danger of immediate dissolution. He was enjoying life, and he was full of ambition and zest. For him there was to be no wasting in despair because a woman was fair and cold. Anne, as she listened to the ceaseless badinage that went on between him and Phil, wondered if she had only imagined that look in his eyes when she had told him she could never care for him. There were not lacking those who would have gladly stepped into Gilbert's vacant place. But Anne snubbed them without fear and without reproach. If the real Prince Charming was never to come, she would have none of a substitute. So she sternly told herself that grey day in the windy park. Suddenly, the rain of Aunt Jamesina's prophecy came with a swish and rush. Anne put up her umbrella and hurried down the slope. As she turned out on the harbour road, a savage gust of wind tore along it. Instantly her umbrella turned wrong side out. Anne clutched at it in despair. And then there came a voice close to her.
"Pardon me. May I offer you the shelter of my umbrella?"
Anne looked up. Tall and handsome and distinguished-looking. Dark, melancholy, inscrutable eyes. Melting, musical, sympathetic voice. Yes, the very hero of her dreams stood before her in the flesh. He could not have more closely resembled her ideal if he had been made to order. "Thank you," she said confusedly.
"We'd better hurry over to that little pavilion on the point,"
suggested the unknown.
"We can wait there until this shower is over. It is not likely to rain so heavily very long."
The words were very commonplace, but oh, the tone, and the smile which accompanied them! Anne felt her heart beating strangely. Together they scurried to the pavilion and sat breathlessly down under its friendly roof. Anne laughingly held up her false umbrella. "It is when my umbrella turns inside out that I am convinced of the total depravity of inanimate things," she said gaily. The raindrops sparkled on her shining hair. Its loosened rings curled around her neck and forehead. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes big and starry. Her companion looked down at her admiringly. She felt herself blushing under his gaze. Who could he be? Why, there was a bit of the Redmond white and scarlet pinned to his coat lapel. Yet she had thought she knew, by sight at least, all the Redmond students except the freshmen. And this courtly youth surely was no freshman.
"We are schoolmates, I see,"
he said, smiling at Anne's colours.
"That ought to be sufficient introduction. My name is Royal Gardner, and you are the Miss Shirley who read the Tennyson paper at the Philomathic the other evening, aren't you?"
"Yes, but I cannot place you at all," said Anne frankly. "Please, where do you belong?"
"I feel as if I didn't belong anywhere yet. I put in my freshman and sophomore years at Redmond 2 years ago. I've been in Europe ever since. Now I've come back to finish my arts course."
"This is my junior year, too," said Anne.
"So we are classmates as well as college mates. I am reconciled to the loss of the years that the locust has eaten,"
said her companion, with a world of meaning in those wonderful eyes of his. The rain came steadily down for the best part of an hour, but the time seemed really very short. When the clouds parted, and a burst of pale November sunshine fell athwart the harbour and the pines, Anne and her companion walked home together. By the time they had reached the gate of Patty's Place, he had asked permission to call, and had received it. Anne went in with cheeks of flame, and her heart beating to her fingertips. Rusty, who climbed into her lap and tried to kiss her, found a very absent welcome. Anne, with her soul full of romantic thrills, had no attention to spare just then for a crop-eared pussy-cat. That evening a parcel was left at Patty's Place for Miss Shirley. It was a box containing a dozen magnificent roses. Phil pounced impertinently on the card that fell from it, read the name, and the poetical quotation written on the back.
"Royal Gardner!"
she exclaimed.
"Why, Anne, I didn't know you were acquainted with Roy Gardner."
"I met him in the park this afternoon in the rain," explained Anne hurriedly. "My umbrella turned inside out, and he came to my rescue with his."
"Oh!"
Phil peered curiously at Anne.
And is that exceedingly commonplace incident any reason why he should send us long-stemmed roses by the dozen, with a very sentimental rhyme? Or why we should blush divinest rosy red when we look at his card? Anne, thy face betrayeth thee.
Don't talk nonsense, Phil. Do you know Mr. Gardner?
I've met his two sisters, and I know of him. So does everybody worthwhile in Kingsport. The Gardners are among the richest, bluest of Bluenoses. Roy is adorably handsome and clever. 2 years ago his mother's health failed, and he had to leave college and go abroad with her. His father is dead. He must have been greatly disappointed to have to give up his class, but they say he was perfectly sweet about it. Fee, fi, fo, fum, Anne. I smell romance. Almost do I envy you, but not quite. After all, Roy Gardner isn't Jonas.
You goose, said Anne loftily. But she lay long awake that night, nor did she wish for sleep. Her waking fancies were more alluring than any vision of dreamland. Had the real prince come at last? Recalling those glorious dark eyes which had gazed so deeply into her own, Anne was very strongly inclined to think he had. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26. Enter Christine. The girls at Patty's Place were dressing for the reception which the juniors were giving for the seniors in February. Anne surveyed herself in the mirror of the blue room with girlish satisfaction. She had a particularly pretty gown on. Originally, it had been only a simple little slip of cream silk with a chiffon overdress. But Phil had insisted on taking it home with her in the Christmas holidays and embroidering tiny rosebuds all over the chiffon. Phil's fingers were deft, and the result was a dress which was the envy of every Redmond girl. Even Allie Boone, whose frocks came from Paris, was wont to look with longing eyes on that rosebud concoction as Anne trailed up the main staircase at Redmond in it. Anne was trying the effect of a white orchid in her hair. Roy Gardner had sent her white orchids for the reception, and she knew no other Redmond girl would have them that night, when Phil came in with admiring gaze.
Anne, this is certainly your night for looking handsome. 9 nights out of 10 I can easily outshine you. The 10th you blossom out suddenly into something that eclipses me altogether. How do you manage it?
It's the dress, dear. Fine feathers.
'Tisn't. The last evening you flamed out into beauty, you wore your old blue flannel shirtwaist that Mrs. Lynde made you. If Roy hadn't already lost head and heart about you, he certainly would tonight. But I don't like orchids on you, Anne. No, it isn't jealousy. Orchids don't seem to belong to you. They're too exotic, too tropical, too insolent. Don't put them in your hair, anyway.
Well, I won't. I admit I'm not fond of orchids myself. I don't think they're related to me. Roy doesn't often send them. He knows I like flowers I can live with. Orchids are only things you can visit with.
Jonas sent me some dear pink rosebuds for the evening. But he isn't coming himself. He said he had to lead a prayer meeting in the slums. I don't believe he wanted to come. Anne, I'm horribly afraid Jonas doesn't really care anything about me. And I'm trying to decide whether I'll pine away and die, or go on and get my B.A. and be sensible and useful.
You couldn't possibly be sensible and useful, Phil, so you'd better pine away and die, said Anne cruelly.
Heartless Anne!
Silly Phil, you know quite well that Jonas loves you.
But he won't tell me so, and I can't make him. He looks it, I'll admit. But speak to me only with thine eyes isn't a really reliable reason for embroidering doilies and hemstitching tablecloths. I don't want to begin such work until I'm really engaged. It would be tempting fate.
Mr. Blake is afraid to ask you to marry him, Phil. He is poor and can't offer you a home such as you've always had. You know that is the only reason he hasn't spoken long ago.
I suppose so,
agreed Phil dolefully.
Well,
brightening up,
if he won't ask me to marry him, I'll ask him, that's all. So it's bound to come right. I won't worry. By the way, Gilbert Blythe is going about constantly with Christine Stuart. Did you know?
Anne was trying to fasten a little gold chain about her throat. She suddenly found the clasp difficult to manage. What was the matter with it? Or with her fingers? No, she said carelessly. Who is Christine Stuart?
Ronald Stuart's sister. She's in Kingsport this winter studying music. I haven't seen her, but they say she's very pretty, and that Gilbert is quite crazy over her. How angry I was when you refused Gilbert, Anne. But Roy Gardner was foreordained for you. I can see that now. You were right after all.
Anne did not blush, as she usually did when the girls assumed that her eventual marriage to Roy Gardner was a settled thing. All at once she felt rather dull. Phil's chatter seemed trivial and the reception a bore. She boxed poor Rusty's ears. "Get off that cushion instantly, you cat, you! Why don't you stay down where you belong?" Anne picked up her orchids and went downstairs, where Aunt Jamesina was presiding over a row of coats hung before the fire to warm. Roy Gardner was waiting for Anne, and teasing the Sarah-cat while he waited. The Sarah-cat did not approve of him. She always turned her back on him. But everybody else at Patty's Place liked him very much. Aunt Jamesina, carried away by his unfailing and deferential courtesy, and the pleading tones of his delightful voice, declared he was the nicest young man she ever knew, and that Anne was a very fortunate girl. Such remarks made Anne restive. Roy's wooing had certainly been as romantic as girlish heart could desire, but she wished Aunt Jamesina and the girls would not take things so for granted. When Roy murmured a poetical compliment as he helped her on with her coat, she did not blush and thrill as usual, and he found her rather silent in their brief walk to Redmond. He thought she looked a little pale when she came out of the co-ed's dressing-room, but as they entered the reception-room, her colour and sparkle suddenly returned to her. She turned to Roy with her gayest expression. He smiled back at her, with what Phil called his deep, black, velvety smile. Yet she really did not see Roy at all. She was acutely conscious that Gilbert was standing under the palms just across the room, talking to a girl who must be Christine Stuart. She was very handsome, in the stately style, destined to become rather massive in middle life. A tall girl, with large dark blue eyes, ivory outlines, and a gloss of darkness on her smooth hair. "She looks just as I've always wanted to look," thought Anne miserably. Rose-leaf complexion, starry violet eyes, raven hair. Yes, she has them all. It's a wonder her name isn't Cordelia Fitzgerald into the bargain. But I don't believe her figure is as good as mine, and her nose certainly isn't. Anne felt a little comforted by this conclusion. End of Chapter 26. Chapter 27. Mutual Confidences. March came in that winter like the meekest and mildest of lambs, bringing days that were crisp and golden and tingling, each followed by a frosty pink twilight which gradually lost itself in an elfland of moonshine. Over the girls at Patty's Place was falling the shadow of April examinations. They were studying hard. Even Phil had settled down to text and notebooks with a doggedness not to be expected of her.
"I'm going to take the Johnson Scholarship in mathematics,"
she announced calmly.
"I could take the one in Greek easily, but I'd rather take the mathematical one, because I want to prove to Jonas that I'm really enormously clever."
"Jonas likes you better for your big brown eyes and your crooked smile than for all the brains you carry under your curls," said Anne.
When I was a girl, it wasn't considered ladylike to know anything about mathematics,"
said Aunt Jamesina.
"But times have changed. I don't know that it's all for the better. Can you cook, Phil?"
No, I never cooked anything in my life, except a gingerbread, and it was a failure. Flat in the middle and hilly round the edges. You know the kind. But, Auntie, when I begin in good earnest to learn to cook, don't you think the brains that enable me to win a mathematical scholarship will also enable me to learn cooking just as well?"
"Maybe,"
said Aunt Jamesina cautiously.
"I am not decrying the higher education of women. My daughter is an M.A. She can cook, too. But I taught her to cook before I let a college professor teach her mathematics."
In mid-March came a letter from Miss Patty Spofford, saying that she and Miss Maria had decided to remain abroad for another year.
"So you may have Patty's Place next winter, too,"
she wrote.
"Maria and I are going to run over Egypt. I want to see the Sphinx once before I die."
Fancy those two dames running over Egypt. I wonder if they'll look up at the Sphinx and knit,"
laughed Priscilla.
"I'm so glad we can keep Patty's Place for another year,"
said Stella.
"I was afraid they'd come back, and then our jolly little nest here would have been broken up, and we poor callow nestlings thrown out on the cruel world of boarding-houses again."
I'm off for a tramp in the park,
announced Phil, tossing her book aside.
I think when I'm 80 I'll be glad I went for a walk in the park tonight.
What do you mean? Asked Anne.
Come with me, and I'll tell you, honey.
They captured in their ramble all the mysteries and magics of a March evening. Very still and mild it was, wrapped in a great, white, brooding silence. A silence which was yet threaded through with many little silvery sounds, which you could hear if you hearkened as much with your soul as your ears. The girls wandered down a long pineland aisle that seemed to lead right out into the heart of a deep red, overflowing winter sunset.
I'd go home and write a poem this blessed minute if I only knew how,
declared Phil, pausing in an open space where a rosy light was staining the green tips of the pines.
It's all so wonderful here, this great white stillness, and those dark trees that always seem to be thinking.
The woods were God's first temples, quoted Anne softly. One can't help feeling reverent and adoring in such a place. I always feel so near him when I walk among the pines.
Anne, I'm the happiest girl in the world,
confessed Phil suddenly. So, Mr. Blake has asked you to marry him at last, said Anne calmly.
Yes, and I sneezed 3 times while he was asking me. Wasn't that horrid? But I said yes almost before he finished. I was so afraid he might change his mind and stop. I'm besottedly happy. I couldn't really believe before that Jonas would ever care for frivolous me.
Phil, you're not really frivolous, said Anne gravely. Way down underneath that frivolous exterior of yours, you've got a dear, loyal, womanly little soul. Why do you hide it so?
I can't help it, Queen Anne. You are right. I'm not frivolous at heart. But there's a sort of frivolous skin over my soul, and I can't take it off. As Mrs. Poyser says, I'd have to be hatched over again, and hatched different, before I could change it. But Jonas knows the real me, and loves me, frivolity and all. And I love him. I never was so surprised in my life as I was when I found out I loved him. I'd never thought it possible to fall in love with an ugly man. Fancy me coming down to one solitary beau. And one named Jonas. But I mean to call him Joe. That's such a nice, crisp little name. I couldn't nickname Alonzo.
What about Alec and Alonzo?
Oh, I told them at Christmas that I never could marry either of them. It seems so funny now to remember that I ever thought it possible that I might. They felt so badly I just cried over both of them. Howled! But I knew there was only one man in the world I could ever marry. I had made up my own mind for once, and it was real easy, too. It's very delightful to feel so sure, and know it's your own sureness, and not somebody else's.
Do you suppose you'll be able to keep it up?
Making up my mind, you mean? I don't know. But Joe has given me a splendid rule. He says, when I'm perplexed, just to do what I would wish I had done when I shall be 80. Anyhow, Joe can make up his mind quickly enough, and it would be uncomfortable to have too much mind in the same house.
What will your father and mother say?
Father won't say much. He thinks everything I do right. But Mother will talk. Oh, her tongue will be as burny as her nose. But in the end, it will be all right.
You'll have to give up a good many things you've always had when you marry Mr. Blake, Phil.
But I'll have him. I won't miss the other things. We're to be married a year from next June. Joe graduates from St. Columbia this spring, you know. Then he's going to take a little mission church down on Patterson Street in the slums. Fancy me in the slums! But I'd go there, or to Greenland's icy mountains with him.
And this is the girl who would never marry a man who wasn't rich, commented Anne to a young pine tree.
Oh, don't cast up the follies of my youth to me. I shall be poor as gaily as I've been rich. You'll see. I'm going to learn how to cook and make over dresses. I've learned how to market since I've lived at Patty's Place, and once I taught a Sunday school class for a whole summer. Aunt Jamesina says I'll ruin Joe's career if I marry him. But I won't. I know I haven't much sense or sobriety, but I've got what is ever so much better, the knack of making people like me. There is a man in Bolingbroke who lisps and always testifies in prayer meeting. He says, if you can't thine like an electric star, thine like a candlestick. I'll be Joe's little candlestick.
Phil, you're incorrigible. Well, I love you so much that I can't make nice, light, congratulatory little speeches, but I'm heart glad of your happiness.
I know. Those big gray eyes of yours are brimming over with real friendship, Anne. Some day I'll look the same way at you. You're going to marry Roy, aren't you, Anne?
My dear Philippa, did you ever hear of the famous Betty Baxter, who refused a man before he'd axed her? I am not going to emulate that celebrated lady by either refusing or accepting anyone before he axes me.
All Redmond knows that Roy is crazy about you,
said Phil candidly.
and you do love him. Don't you, Anne?
I suppose so, said Anne reluctantly. She felt that she ought to be blushing while making such a confession, but she was not. On the other hand, she always blushed hotly when anyone said anything about Gilbert Blythe or Christine Stuart in her hearing. Gilbert Blythe and Christine Stuart were nothing to her, absolutely nothing. But Anne had given up trying to analyze the reason of her blushes. As for Roy, of course she was in love with him, madly so. How could she help it? Was he not her ideal? Who could resist those glorious dark eyes and that pleading voice? Were not half the Redmond girls wildly envious? And what a charming sonnet he had sent her, with a box of violets, on her birthday. Anne knew every word of it by heart. It was very good stuff of its kind, too. Not exactly up to the level of Keats or Shakespeare. Even Anne was not so deeply in love as to think that. But it was very tolerable magazine verse. And it was addressed to her, not to Laura or Beatrice or the Maid of Athens, but to her, Anne Shirley. To be told in rhythmical cadences that her eyes were stars of the morning, that her cheek had the flush it stole from the sunrise, that her lips were redder than the roses of paradise, was thrillingly romantic. Gilbert would never have dreamed of writing a sonnet to her eyebrows. But then, Gilbert could see a joke. She had once told Roy a funny story, and he had not seen the point of it. She recalled the chummy laugh she and Gilbert had had together over it, and wondered uneasily if life with a man who had no sense of humour might not be somewhat uninteresting in the long run. But who could expect a melancholy, inscrutable hero to see the humorous side of things? It would be flatly unreasonable. End of chapter 27.